on, it says the respiratory system, short. So that's the one you'll refer to. Trying to make this, there we go, so we can write on the board if we need to. So we're just going to get started, and thankfully you guys have reviewed the chapter ahead of time, so that's really helpful. So the respiratory system is designed to bring in air to our lungs and have gas exchange, and then exhale the waste. What's the waste that we are trying to exhale from our respiratory system? Carbon dioxide. Okay, so we are diffusing into the capillaries is our oxygen, diffusing out is our carbon dioxide. And so the respiratory system is built to allow air to come in, get to the very thin-walled exchange surfaces in the lungs to have this gas exchange occur. And very closely related to the respiratory system is your cardiovascular system, because we have the whole right side of the heart that's pumping blood solely to the lungs for this gas exchange. So there is a really close relationship. Okay, so, sorry, I look at the board expecting to point things out to you. There are 5 important components or functions to the respiratory system. You know, I always ask a question about this on a quiz or an exam. Whenever we have a list of things, you should know those, okay? So the first function is providing a very big gas exchange surface, and the way we do that is by, well, we haven't talked, the gas exchange surface, when we get deep inside the lung, are in these little pockets that are 1 cell thick called alveoli. And so it's getting those little alveoli, because they're little round like pockets. So if we had a little, oh, of course, this one doesn't work. Little airway here, and it ends, and it kind of looks like a bunch of grapes, but that is an alveoli. And so by having this kind of curved surface, all of that is the respiratory surface. It increases your surface area instead of what if we had like a balloon, which one has more surface area inside. Some of you guys know this. So I'm going to write it on here too. So if we had the balloons, we have increased our surface area. If we just had a round thing at the bottom, just a round place for gas exchange, we'll have less surface area, and that doesn't allow us to maximize the amount of gas exchange we can do. So we have a large amount of surface area, and we increase the surface area by the shape of where gas exchange occurs. Another function of the respiratory system is to move air from outside our body in and back out again. And so we have, we'll learn about the anatomy of the upper and lower respiratory tract and all of those places that air travels. Excuse me. Another function of the respiratory system is actually to protect the respiratory system from the external environment. So there's a couple ways that can happen. For example, lining our trachea is that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells. And so those cilia help move up mucus that's naturally produced in the respiratory system. So that's meant to trap any particles, dust, things that don't belong in the respiratory system, move them up and out. So that's a very good way to help protect the respiratory system from potential pathogens, things that can make you sick or have an allergic response like pollen. And the respiratory system is also used to produce sound. If you cannot push air over your vocal folds, otherwise known as vocal cords, you can't produce sound. So you have to be able to push air over those. And the respiratory system has a close association with your nasal cavity. And so there is a component of sense of smell with the respiratory system. Okay. I'm sorry I don't have a picture to put up here showing you the division between the upper and lower respiratory tract, but since you did do your homework, I'm pretty sure you have an idea. If not, again, I'm recording this and I'll put it up so you can look at this. So, excuse me. Pull up we're going old school. Let's see if one of these has the respiratory system. So, what part do you think takes up most of the space? The upper or lower respiratory tract? Okay, that was a bad question. Give me a second. Oh, here we go, lungs. Okay, all right. It's better than nothing. So we have our chart up. Okay, so the upper respiratory system is everything above the larynx. This is not the best. It's not going to have every little thing on it. Where is it? Laryngeal vesicle. Okay, so it's kind of like the Adam's apple. So it's kind of like right there. Okay, so upper respiratory system is pretty much your head and the very kind of beginning of your neck a little bit. So, and then the lower respiratory system is your trachea down below and that whole respiratory tree. So your upper, the larynx is kind of what people call the Adam's apple. So from the larynx and above is your upper respiratory, and then from there below is your lower respiratory system. Okay, so in the respiratory tract, you can divide the tubes that are carrying gas, whether it's oxygen, carbon dioxide. Well, it's going to have a mix of other things, whatever is in your environment, like nitrogen is another gas that's you're breathing in all the time. I can't remember the percent of nitrogen that's in the environment. Okay, so in this respiratory tract, you have two portions, and you can divide it into two sections. One is the conducting portion, and then the respiratory portion. So two divisions. So make sure you know those divisions. And so the conducting portion is from your nasal cavity to what we call the terminal bronchioles. So nasal, just say nose. You guys got the idea. Nose. Let's do it to terminal bronchioles. So this is something you definitely need to know, okay? And that's the conducting. So it's called conducting because it's conducting air, okay? And then the respiratory portion is the small portion, and this is where gas exchange is actually occurring. And so this is, we call them respiratory bronchioles. And where gas exchange is actually officially occurring is in the alveoli. So two major sections. And so the conducting portion is almost all the respiratory system until you get to those little gas exchange bubbles that look like grapes, the alveoli. Okay, so you definitely need to know those two sections. I'm just highlighting these in here for you. Okay, so official definition of an alveoli. These are those lovely little pockets I tried to draw before. The whole group of grapes. I know, this is like serious artwork. I should go into art. Okay, so those alveoli, those little pockets, this is where gas exchange is actually occurring. And the alveoli is one cell thick. So let's think about this. We want things to diffuse across that membrane. So we want gases to diffuse across the wall of the alveoli into the capillaries that surround it. So what kind of cell is the best cell if we want diffusion to occur? Simple squamous epithelium, because it is the thinnest cell and it means it's going to be easiest for things to diffuse across. So yes, That epithelium is simple squamous epithelium, which makes it a nice thin membrane, and right outside the membrane is a nice rich capillary bed, so it's very easy for gas exchange to occur across that membrane. Okay, so a little bit more about that epithelium. We can generally just call it respiratory epithelium. It is that simple squamous epithelium, and the walls are very thin. So again, why we have the simple squamous epithelium, and someone found a way to measure this and says the alveoli walls must be less than 1 micrometer thick. That's really, really, really thin. Okay, and the surface area needs to be very high. And so the interesting thing about this is there's actually a reference point. It says the surface area of this respiratory epithelium in the alveoli is about 35 times the surface area of our body. So just think about the surface area of our skin, and then 35 times the amount of surface area of that is how much we have for gas exchange, which is a huge amount. So important to remember. Then we have what's called respiratory mucosa. And so we hear that mucosa reminds you of what? Yeah, it's mucus. So remember, important point, lining the respiratory tract, mucous membrane. What kind of cell makes mucus? Do you remember? Goblet cells. Okay. So the respiratory mucosa is just a layer of epithelial cells, because epithelial cells is the only cells you find associated with your goblet or mucus-producing cells. So we'll see here. And the respiratory mucosa, the part with all the mucus and stuff, is lining only the conducting portion, okay? So only in the conducting portion will you have that mucous membrane. You don't want a mucous membrane in the respiratory portion, because it's going to block the ability for gas to diffuse across that respiratory membrane. You get a thick layer of mucus, how is gas going to pass through that and the alveolar wall? It's not going to. So you only have mucous membranes in the conducting portion, that's from your nasal cavity to the terminal bronchiole. This little dude, the little tube leading to the alveoli, I'm drawing the picture here too, that is your respiratory bronchiole, and then you have your alveoli. Though that portion, that one little section, no goblet cells, no mucus, okay? So make sure you remember where you find the respiratory mucosa. Okay, so sorry we can't see these pictures today. So in the upper respiratory tract, where we have that mucous membrane, so in the conducting portion, okay, so let's put this mucosa, goblet cells, remember that. And it does have an important function, so remembering that. Okay, so underlying, so if we did we're going to do a brief recap of the anatomy of epithelial cells. So I'm just going to do square, what do they call it, simple cuboidal, just to make it easier. So I'm going to put a couple of these together. And I know, again, my artistic ability is fantastic. So what is one thing that all epithelial cells have in common? It's kind of a tough question because it's been a while since we've talked about it. It's our basement membrane. All epithelial cells have a basement membrane, okay? Remember that? We always have a fixed side and an open end. Okay, so we have a basement membrane. Underlying the basement membrane, we have connective tissue, loose areolar connective tissue. Okay, so I'm just representing that as this red here in this picture. So that's our, I'm just going to do LA. So loose areolar connective tissue, okay? Okay. So just a reminder of kind of what we see. And of course, these are simple. I should just draw them squamous. I don't want to confuse anybody. Okay, so this is such an awesome drawing. Okay, so this is part of the conducting portion. So the conducting, I wish I had green. The conducting portion, what do we find? So, okay, mucous membrane, conducting portion, all of that is mucosa, right? So, oh, I don't want to use black. So on the upper surface and the apical surface, remember apical is the free surface. So on that upper surface, you have a layer of mucus. Okay? So remember that mucus helps trap things into the respiratory system and bring them up and out. So we just want to make sure you remember that. So underneath your basement membrane and your loose areolar connective tissue, you have a layer called the lamina propria. It's actually some connective tissue. Just remember that in the upper respiratory system, this includes everything that's conducting, like your trachea, the main bronchi to the right or left lung, and all those little smaller tubes of bronchioles that bring air to the respiratory portion. Okay? And also remembering that your conducting portion is a mucosal membrane, and so lining the open surface, you're going to have that mucus. Underneath the loose areolar connective tissue, then you'll have a thicker connective tissue here that we call your lamina propria. Okay? So, wow, we've got layers. Okay, so then when you do study, refer back to these notes because it shows you that connective tissue layer, the lamina propria. It's a couple lovely pictures here. Moving to the conducting, still in the conducting portion, in the lower part of the respiratory system, so within the lungs, you also have smooth muscle underlying the conducting portion. So smooth muscle that's surrounding those bronchioles. And smooth muscle, it's not a bad thing, but for example, something that could happen is, say you have asthma. When that hits, it causes the smooth muscle that's surrounding those bronchioles to constrict, which then makes it very difficult to breathe. So there are good reasons for having smooth muscle there, and we'll talk about them as we get through this chapter, but there also are some downsides to having smooth muscle lining our conducting portion, especially when we get down to the lower portions, closer to the respiratory portions. Okay, so talking about how the respiratory system is able to defend itself against pathogens or infections. Several things that help with this process. First of all, that mucus layer. We've referred to it in the past as the mucus escalator, up and out of your trachea. That mucous membrane, the pseudostratified ciliary, columnated epithelial cells help move that mucus up and out. So we just want to remember that. I'm even writing it on here so you can remember mucus elevator. Not elevator, escalator. That's the word I wanted. Escalator. And I can spell. Okay, so then part of that mucous membrane, so the cilia. So this is one of those times when I would definitely ask you what type of epithelial cell is involved with that. So it's your, write it down if you haven't already, pseudostratified because I will ask you. Columnar, pseudostratified, columnar, ciliated epithelium. Okay, make sure you know that. Another defense, so this is defense number 3. So number 1 was mucus. Number 2 is the cilia that helps move the mucus. Number 3 is filtration. And this happens in your nasal cavity, which is also totally lined with, is a mucous membrane, first of all, and that mucus comes from our goblet cells. And so you have that same sort of thing happening in your nasal cavity, where whatever you're breathing in can get trapped in the mucus. Let's say it's pollen or dust or dust or anything else. Hopefully can get trapped in that mucus, and then you sneeze or you have to blow your nose, and that helps filter some of that stuff from even getting into your trachea. Gross example. How many of you have worked with horses in the past? Anybody? Anybody? No? A few people. Okay. Well, you already know I'm from California. I've worked with horses for years, and in the summer, California's hot and dry. And if you're working in an arena with horses, there's lots and lots of dust. Even if you go out on the trails, lots and lots of dust, unless you're the first person in line. That's the best place to be. But if you're breathing dust all day, your nasal cavity is working pretty hard. This is gross, but you blow your nose after a day like that, you're blowing out a lot of dirt that your nasal cavity did a good job of trapping. Okay? It's true, it's from experience. So I know that it works. Unfortunately, yes. Then the fourth component of the defense system of the respiratory system is what we would call alveolar macrophages. So we did talk about macrophages before. In the immune system, we know that those squeeze out of the capillaries via diapedesis and go travel around the tissues and engulf things that don't belong or break down old cells. But we have a special type of macrophage that lives in the respiratory system. They stay in there, so these are very special macrophages. So they live, they're called alveolar macrophages, so they're within the alveoli, and they also, just like anywhere else in the body, will engulf anything that doesn't belong. Okay? So they're there, and they're specifically to protect your lungs. Your lungs get infected, that can cause some problems. So we'll talk about just infections and such later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the upper respiratory tract. So I'm going to erase these lovely drawings here. I liked that one. Yeah, we'll go over here. Okay, so anatomy. Your mouth, your oral cavity is part of the respiratory system. Okay, sometimes, maybe initially it doesn't, it doesn't make sense, but yeah, if your nose is plugged, you breathe through your mouth. I mean, as a mom, I've said this many times when my son nose is stuffy and you can't breathe. I'm sure you all have been there, and you're trying to sleep and you get so frustrated because you can't breathe. As a mom, you're like, okay, breathe with your mouth open. And for little kids, it's like an aha moment. Oh, I can breathe with my mouth open. Yes, you can. So your oral cavity is a component of the respiratory system because you can breathe in through your mouth. Nasal cavity, also component of the respiratory system. The other way you can bring in air into the respiratory system. Mouth and nasal cavity are the two ways you get air into your respiratory tract. Okay? Normally, you just use the nasal cavity. That's for regular breathing, resting, normal, calm breathing. Okay? But breathing through the mouth is if you're breathing heavily, or you're exercising, or your nose is stuffed up, or if you're giving a lecture like Dr. Utt, it's easier for me to breathe through my mouth than to stop and breathe through my nose because I'm talking. So kind of depends on what you're doing, if you're going to breathe in through your mouth or breathe in through your nose. Okay. So you can close your mouth so you can prevent that from air moving in and out, but your nasal cavity is always open for air passageway, unless you plug your nose, I suppose. Air that passes through the nasal cavity enters the first portion of our conducting system here. Of course, this picture is lovely. So the first portion is called the pharynx. Oh, we have a side picture, and no, it's not the best. But the pharynx is within kind of the head region itself, and there's 3 sections. So somebody mentioned that when they were maybe they had a question on their homework about the pharynx. But the pharynx is the first, it's cavity right at the back of your nasal cavity. So this is the first conducting portion of the respiratory system, is in the back of the nasal cavity. Okay? And so sometimes we call the pharynx the throat. So it's behind your nasal cavity. It's kind of back there. You could see a little bit of it if you open your mouth wide and look in the mirror. The back wall, it's part of your pharynx. Okay? So your pharynx can be subdivided into 3 sections. So we'll do that. I'm just going to bring you with me over here. So we need to know our 3 subdivisions. Ooh, so hopefully I can spell. Yeah, okay. Pharynx. That's an X, by the way. So the first division is the nasopharynx. Where are we going to find that? So right behind the nose. Yep. Just like it sounds. So naso. Okay, second, oropharynx. Where are we going to find that? What is oro mean? What? Oh, I thought someone said gold. I was like, oh, really? Yeah, so right, kind of the cavity behind our mouth. So the pharynx, as I was telling you, is behind your nose, behind your mouth. That's true. But now we're talking about the subdivisions of it. The last is the laryngopharynx. Okay, and so that's the lowest portion of the pharynx, and that is going to be down where the larynx is. Okay, and so that's below your oral cavity. It's where that Adam's apple is, or what we would commonly refer to as the voice box. And that area is protected with a lot of connective tissue and cartilage, and the reason for that is also it houses the structures that allow you to make sound, that allow you to talk. Those are, I'm getting ahead of myself, I'm sorry. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But within the laryngeal pharynx, we have a really cool structure called the epiglottis. Okay? And the epiglottis is made out of cartilage. What's the most common cartilage we have in our body? Hyaline. Good to remember. And what the epiglottis does, it is basically like a lid to the larynx. Okay? Let's see if we can see that on our chart here. So the larynx is kind of within this portion here. And I know in the back it's hard to see this drawing. I can turn the lights on, I suppose, a little bit more. Ooh, my bad. Lights? I'm trying to give you guys light back there. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the epiglottis is above the larynx, and so it's made of cartilage. And what happens, you guys have seen this with your meeks, your esophagus is behind your trachea. Do you remember that? You've seen that. You've seen the trachea. You should have seen the esophagus by now. And so when you swallow something, you want to make sure it goes down the right pipe. Yeah? So when your body has a really great way to ensure that something you swallow only goes down the esophagus, not into the respiratory tract, because that will cause problems. So the epiglottis, when you swallow, folds over and covers the opening to the airway, covers the opening to the larynx, to prevent whatever you're swallowing from going into your airway. Okay? So it's a very important job that the epiglottis has. And if it malfunctions, sometimes people say, oh, if you were drinking something and you start coughing, you say, oh, it went down the wrong pipe. Yeah, it literally went down the wrong tube and you got a little bit of something into your trachea. That's why you're coughing. So most of the time the epiglottis works great. Once in a while, something gets past it and you start coughing. Usually it's not a big deal. Okay. I have this huge picture, which I can't show you, but please, you're going to have to study this, maybe listen to the audio version or just look at the PowerPoint version. Shows you, again, it's this really great anatomy picture of all of the structures. It is kind of busy, but I did highlight the 3 sections of the upper respiratory system. Well, actually, the 3 sections of the pharynx. So it will be good to look at this because it was really hard to do this, by the way. So in different colors, the nasopharynx, where you find that, the oropharynx, and what structures are included in that, and then the laryngopharynx, which is the lowest part, and what structures are included in that. So for your reference, that's slide 11. Please take a look at that, okay? So I already talked about the epiglottis. So the epiglottis covers the larynx, as we talked about. Most of the time does a really great job of preventing things from going down the trachea. There are 2 types of cartilage that you find in the pharynx. And these 2 cartilage types are also on your MINC list. And so it is the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. Okay, so those should sound hopefully familiar, which, by the way, is real quick. I'll just give you my ploy of, please, when you come to lab, bring your MINC list, bring your pictures. Okay, so just my friendly reminder. So thyroid cartilage and cricoid cartilage, both of these combined forms the structure of your larynx. Okay, and seen easily in males as the Adam's apple. It's not as visible in females. I don't know, it's more pronounced in males. So those 2 cartilage types make up, protect your larynx, and I think the word is hypertrophy in males, which has to do with your voice being lower than typical female's voice. Okay. All right, and so then again, I'm going to tell you on slide 13, I again have highlighted that lovely anatomy picture here. Those 3 structures we just talked about. Well, so the epiglottis is highlighted. Then we have those 2 cartilage types, the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, and where exactly you find them. And this actually, when you review this, will actually help you with your MINC as well. Which cartilage do we find higher? Which cartilage do we find lower? So you know the cricoid cartilage is lower and the thyroid cartilage is higher. So on humans, the thyroid cartilage is covered by the thyroid gland. And it is with many other animals. Apparently the mink is an exception to that, but I don't know what its deal is. So thyroid gland covers the thyroid cartilage. Below it, you have the cricoid cartilage. So for reference, that was slide 13. Okay, so more on the thyroid cartilage. Oh, I don't want to step into that. Okay, so within the thyroid cartilage, or protected by it, is the structures that allow you to make sound. Okay, and so people commonly refer to them as vocal cords. They're not actually vocal cords. They're vocal folds. They're actually folds in the tissue lining your larynx. So I know this is hard for you to see, so you're going to have to refer back to your pictures when you're studying. And so you have these vocal folds, and those are within the larynx. Okay? And when you push air over those vocal folds, you cause them to vibrate, and that produces sound. Okay? And so sounds and speech, and it does take a while to learn how to make sounds and learn how to form words. It takes babies a while because it's quite a process. So you have 2 folds. Okay. I don't know how I'm going to draw this. So you have your vocal fold, and then you have like a little ledge above it. And it's really hard to kind of describe this, so we're going to have to look at the anatomy. You're going to have to look at a picture, and I'm sorry. So above and on the sides, or to the sides of these vocal folds, is what we would call vestibular folds. And they are there to help protect the vocal folds, or your vocal cords, if you prefer. And so it's kind of like a shelf where if anything does get into the larynx, it hopefully will get trapped there with the vestibular folds. It's there to protect the vocal cords, to prevent anything from getting into the vocal cords or damaging them. So those vestibular cords are there to protect your vocal folds. Okay? Let's see here. So then, of course, there's that next picture highlighting exactly where that is. That's on slide 15. It shows you the vocal fold. And this picture, since it's a perfect mid-sagittal section of the head, the one thing this picture lacks is the vestibular folds. Okay, so you'll just need to remember that above your vocal cord, I'm going to draw this in so when you're studying you can see that. So above your vocal fold, I'm doing it in yellow, you would have your, what do we call that? Yes, vestibular folds help protect the vocal fold. Okay? Okay, so we're just going to begin the lower respiratory tract. And lower respiratory tract, most of the respiratory tract is the lower respiratory tract. Okay? And so it's from everything from below the larynx all the way down to the individual alveoli where gas is being exchanged. So we can divide it into two major sections. Still the same, which makes life a little easier. So in the lower respiratory tract, divide it into your conducting zone, and then you also the respiratory zone. Okay, two zones within your lower respiratory tract. So within the conducting zone, you have all these tubes that are enforced with cartilage, like your trachea. So they're held open all the time to allow air to pass through. Air that gets all the way to the respiratory bronchioles. So if we didn't have the cartilage there, what would happen? Let's say even in our trachea, what if we didn't have cartilage? Our airway would collapse. You wouldn't be able to breathe. Okay, so you have to hold it open. It's being held open and supported by hyaline cartilage. All the way down to the smallest little tubes, you have it supported by cartilage that allows it to stay open and not collapse. Collapsing means you can't breathe. Okay, and then the very ends of these tubes, you get to the respiratory zone, which really only has your respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli. And you also have a little bit of cartilage there to support those tubes. And we're going to stop with that. Thank you for your patience and start with slide 17 on Wednesday. Thank you very much.